Hello everyone, I'd like to invite you to my channel. Before we get started, I'd appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. It's really simple, but it'll make me happy. It was a hot Thursday in August, just after noon, and I decided to start the daunting task of tidying up the garage. My wife Natalie and I were going to put the house up for sale after John Jr., our only child, was due to go to college next month. I should mention that Nat was in the cool of our air-conditioned house. The house was already conditioned, and we were doing the same thing as me, sorting things from our closets. It's amazing how much stuff you can accumulate in 24 years of marriage. I was only thinking about 3 categories as I went through the numerous boxes: donation, relocation, and disposal. I didn't have the luxury of working under air conditioning, so I left the double garage doors open to try to get at least some air movement. I was walking down the stairs with my back to the entrance. I was holding a big, heavy box when I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my head. I saw a bright flash of light in front of my eyes and blacked out. When I came to, I was in pain and felt like I was going to throw up. It took me a moment to remember what had happened. As I went down the stairs, I immediately thought that I must have misjudged my step. I fell backwards on the cement floor and hit my head. The throbbing in my skull continued as I assessed my position. I wasn't in the garage. I was sitting in an armchair in my bedroom. My first thought was, why am I sitting on a chair when I should be lying in bed? At first, I thought I was paralyzed because my arms and legs were not responding to my commands. I was sitting in a rickety straight. I was in a wooden chair that usually stood in front of our desktop computer in the guest room. The chair was now at the foot of our large bed. I tried to move again, and then I realized that I wasn't paralyzed after all. I was tied hand and foot to a chair. The room was empty and quiet. When my head started to clear, I made a few observations. I quickly assessed the situation and realized Natalie was the priority. I tried to free my arms and move my legs, but my ankles were tied to the chair legs and my left arm was taped to the armrest. My right wrist was handcuffed to the chair, but I could move my right arm a little due to the handcuffs. I was still unable to move. My only thought was that someone had invaded our house. I hoped Natalie was tied up somewhere else while the thief or thieves ransacked the house in search of valuables. I stopped twitching, trying to hear any noise that might give a clue to what was going on. What bothered me the most was that my wife Nat was still an extremely attractive woman with a great figure. If the scumbags had the guts to invade the house in broad daylight, they might not hesitate to take Natalie as an unexpected bonus. I prayed that they would take her by surprise and she would not be able to see their faces. I knew that criminals with such audacity don't leave witnesses behind. There was a chance that my wife had been tied up and gagged in another room and the thieves had already left with that in mind. I started struggling with my shackles again, shouting Nat's name several times. Then he stopped. I was hoping to hear some kind of answer, but so far I hadn't heard anything. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs and Natalie's muffled voice. I prayed that they would take her by surprise and she would not be able to see their faces. I knew that criminals with such audacity don't leave witnesses behind. On the other hand, there was a chance that my wife had been tied up and gagged in another room, and the thieves had already left. I started struggling with my shackles again, shouting Nat's name several times. Then he stopped, hoping to hear some kind of answer, but so far he has not heard anything. I was really relieved to hear footsteps on the stairs and Natalie's muffled voice. I was really disappointed when an angry male voice ordered her to shut up and keep walking. The door was roughly flung open and Nat was pushed in the back so that she almost tripped over the door sill. She had her W on from 4 a.m. after a shift from 4 p.m. morning. By midnight, I'd bumped into her at a bar where the cops were hanging out. Kenny's bar was owned and operated mostly by Kenny himself, who was a retired police officer. I wasn't Natalie's partner yet, but it was only a matter of time since she was new to the precinct and would have to double her work in each patrol sector to get an idea of the terrain. I introduced myself, we had a few beers and generally got on like a house on fire. The guys on my team were either married or in a serious relationship, so I didn't have to worry about competition. The details of our courtship are unimportant, but it was short and intense. We've been married for 24 years, and we have a son, John Jr., or Johnny as we call him. We bought the house we live in right after Johnny was born. Shortly after our son was born, I became a detective and worked shifts from 5, I'm not sure exactly what time it was, but it was around 10 p.m. From 9 p.m. to midnight. Not long after that, Natalie started working shifts from 8 to 16, then from 16 to midnight, and finally from midnight to 8. When she retired at the age of 42, she'd been working for 20 years. The job was getting more and more dangerous, so I was glad she was off the street. I planned to work for a few more years before I retired myself. I was planning to retire myself, but when Johnny got an offer to go to college in Pennsylvania, we decided that the savings on tuition would allow me to quit and we could move to a warmer climate. Natalie was still sitting on the floor when I screamed, "What do you want, you bastard?" He stood up. He was between me and the bed, holding a knife to my throat and smiling maliciously, revealing several missing teeth. He leaned close to my face and laughed, saying in a low voice, "You have a shitty head." Yes, I'm a bastard, and you'll find out soon enough. I didn't know what was going on. If she's involved with me, leave my wife alone. He saw Nat struggling to get up out of the corner of his eye, so he turned around and growled, "Sit on the bed," to emphasize this. He pressed the knife a little harder under my chin, forcing me to tilt my head back. Nat was sitting quietly. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking scared. I knew that the only thing I could do was get him to talk, so I asked why he was doing this. "I don't know you, and I'm sure my wife doesn't know you. Why don't you just take what you want and leave? Leave us alone, and I'll forget you." "We're here," he said sarcastically, turning to Natalie. "I'll take what I want, no doubt about it. I'll tell you why I'm here. I've been thinking about seeing you again for the last 14 years. I've been locked up in a cage like an animal." He told me he'd been in prison for 14 years. It was a pretty rough existence. He said he'd been beaten almost to death, had to resort to survival sex, lived with cockroaches and bad food, and had no contact with women. Then he turned to my wife and told her to strip and do it quickly. When Natalie hesitated, shifting her frightened eyes from me to him, he screamed, "Damn it, do what you're told." The bastard drove the blade under my chin so hard that I bled, running down my neck. He eased the pressure of the blade slightly, but my head was still tilted so far back that I couldn't see. Natalie, I was struggling to speak without hurting myself even more, but I still managed to ask why she and I had some kind of history. She was a cop, wasn't she? All cops suck, and that's exactly what she's going to be doing in the near future. As if, he added, maybe I should turn your chair around, then you won't have to look. He laughed and answered his own question, "No, that would be too easy. You'll be watching us, this is part of the reckoning." Glancing at Nat, who had only unbuttoned a few buttons on her blouse, "You have 1 minute to take off the rest of your clothes or I'll cut off one of his ears." My wife took off the rest of her clothes and stood there, ashamed, staring at the floor. There was something familiar about him, but I couldn't remember who. He was short, about 170 centimeters, and weighed about 65 kilograms. He had a haggard look. His face was like a meth addict's, with gray hair and receding hairlines in front and a bald spot at the back. When he turned his head, he didn't wear a beard, but he had stubble for 4 or 5 days. Both of his arms were covered with tattoos, and the knuckles on one hand were tattooed with a hat. Cops are the worst, aren't they? Then I saw something else and remembered that on his left shoulder was a tattoo of a skull with a red and black snake crawling into his mouth through his nostrils and crawling back out through his eye socket. "Myers's bastards," I spat out with disgust. He smiled like I recognized him straight away, but he didn't say anything. His real name was Sidney, but everyone called him Mutt. He was in a biker gang called Tombstone. When I arrested him 15 years ago, he had long hair and a thick beard, so I guess I didn't recognize him at first because of his small stature, and he needed to prove himself to his much larger accomplices to earn a reputation as the most violent and reckless of them all. The skull was the gang's logo, and each of them had it on their hands somewhere. All the details of the case came back to me. He lived in the southeastern part of the city, where the area was rapidly being renovated. It was getting rid of slums and boarded-up shops, which slowly turned into something else over several decades. The old housing was either knocked down or converted into co-ops or condos. Some of the shops have already been renovated and reopened to serve the growing number of young professionals who couldn't afford to live in the expensive northern part of the city. A Starbucks cafe was built on one of the vacant lots. Another old brick building was renovated and opened as Allen Chop House Restaurant. There were rumors that the county was thinking about opening a branch library to speed up reconstruction and attract businesses to the area. However, there were still signs of the area's seedy days. One of these was a biker bar called The Cave. A young couple, Joe and Mary Ellen Canetti, bought the bankrupt business along with the building with the intention of renovating it without closing it in order to earn some income. Their plan was to turn it into a trendy. The cafe was aimed at the dining crowd, to attract people from the surrounding businesses as well as businesses that were re-emerging in the area. Joe installed a floor-to-ceiling canvas partition separating the bar from the rear dining area. He wanted to carry out the necessary demolition and reconstruction work so that the rubbish wouldn't get into the bar. Mary Ellen was a housewife who took care of their 18-month-old child. In a month's time, Joe hired Kelly, the bartender who had previously worked there, to serve the few daytime patrons of the bar while he worked in the back repairing the future dining area and the long-abandoned kitchen. The biker patronage was slowly eroding, partly because Joe treated them like __, and partly because of the redevelopment of the neighborhood. Joe was a former Marine, under 190 centimeters tall and weighing 110 kilograms. The locals soon learned the hard way that he doesn't tolerate any nonsense. Unfortunately, what Joe didn't know was that Kelly was the girlfriend of one of the Hells Angels. They still came to the bar sometimes, mostly because Kelly continued to work there. The bar didn't open until 10. By 11, Joe had been working in the back since 8, peeling off the side walls and removing tarnished and broken lighting fixtures. Kelly hadn't opened the bar yet. Joe called her on her cell, but it went straight to voicemail. He was pretty annoyed. He had a schedule for the grand opening in his head and he hated stopping while he was on a roll to keep an eye on the bar for the few customers who could come in. Also, he was in dirty work clothes and despite the lack of visitors, he didn't want to look like he was just hanging out there. He didn't want to appear in front of them in such a shabby way. Plus, precious time was lost for repairs. He reluctantly called his wife, explained the situation, and asked if she could take her son to his mother and replace him at the bar. Mary Ellen has already replaced Kelly several times when she needed a vacation to attend to personal matters. His wife arrived shortly before 11. She unlocked the front door and went into the back to tell Joe she was there and would be looking after the bar. It was about 3 o'clock. It was 3 p.m. when the Mutt and 2 of his friends came in. 2 regulars were sitting at the bar drinking beer and occasionally drinking whiskey. The Mutt's friends were big and intimidating guys with thick beards and numerous tattoos, including neck and face. Like most of their kind, they were more fat than muscular, but their imposing size combined with their sullenly loud demeanor had the desired effect. The old-timers finished their drinks and left shortly after one of the bikers went to the men's room, which was just behind the end of the bar. While Mary Ellen was distracted by drink orders, he slipped behind the bar, grabbed her from behind and clamped his big hand over her mouth. The Mutt joined him, and Mary Ellen struggled fruitlessly, unable to scream. The Mutt rummaged in her pockets, pulled out the key to the front door and locked it, turning the sign on the steely to closed. Joe was working with a saw and didn't hear or see anything until someone hit him. When he came to, he was tied up and lying on the kitchen floor in a pool of blood. The attacker had tied his hands behind his back and led him behind a cast iron pipe, preventing him from moving despite the pain. Joe was thinking about his wife and what could have happened to her. He was scared for her because he knew she was in trouble. Otherwise, she would have come to check on him. He kept shouting her name, but there was no response. He tried to free himself from the shackles, but he couldn't. It was 3:37. A police car, driven by a rookie officer, spotted 3 Tombstone motorcycles parked outside the bar. Despite his youth, the officer was a smart guy and knew that criminals did not hang around other people's parties. It was a Hells Angels place, or at least it used to be. He wrote down the license plates and time of day in his notebook and was about to get out of the car to take a closer look when he got a call. It was necessary to stop a domestic dispute, so he had to leave when Mongrel and his friends left the bar. Mary Ellen Canetti was lying naked on a blood-soaked billiard table. She had been raped and her throat was cut. When the criminals left, they did not bother to lock the door. At about 4, at 2000 hours, a customer came in and saw the state of the place and called the police. The unit that got the call was the same young officer who'd been dealing with a domestic violence call less than an hour earlier. The patrol chief and a detective unit were sent to the scene. I was in the detective unit, and when we arrived, the uniformed police had just started guarding the crime scene. The patrol sergeant told me that when they entered the room, before they could do anything, they heard screams from the back of the bar. They went there carefully. They found a man tied to a sink pipe. He was screaming, Mary Ellen, where is my wife?" Despite the number of officers, they couldn't hold him back when he rushed into the hall. When he saw his wife, he fell to the floor and started vomiting. Joe was sitting in an old booth behind a tarp. I sat down in front of him. It was a policeman's worst nightmare. I had to listen to heartbreaking sobs and ask questions that only aggravated his grief. It didn't take long to realize that he couldn't help identify the killers. The only thing I got the impression that the regular barmaid, a girl named Kelly Porra, was supposed to be working that night, but she didn't show up and didn't call in. It later came to light that, about a week before Marianne's murder, one of the Tombstone women was cornered in a parking lot and beaten and raped by two Hells Angels for some express disregard for the club. Unfortunately, the gangs don't report incidents like this to the police. They have their own form of lynching, so there were no police records of the incident. It was just street gossip, so Merrill and Khan just happened. It was just bad luck that Kelly Porra was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The killers assumed it was her and they wanted revenge. We'll never know if she knew she was on their firing list and whether that was the reason she didn't show up for work. Thanks to the young officer's diligence, the mutt and his friends were detained on the same day. The DNA evidence was incontrovertible. It was established that although all three raped the girl, the mutt was the one who cut her throat. The court gave all three a sentence of between 25 years and life. I don't know how this piece of __ managed to get free after 14 years. I was scared for my wife, even though I was tied up. My hands were shaking. I knew, and Natalie probably knew, that this killer wouldn't leave witnesses. I saw with my own eyes what bestial savagery he is capable of. I also knew that I needed time. He pushed Nat, forcing her to sit on the edge of the bed. I screamed, "What did you decide to do? Take revenge for the murder and rape of an innocent young wife and mother, for leaving an infant without a mother, for making my father have nightmares for the rest of his life, for what? Do you think you shouldn't have been punished for causing such destruction to innocent people? What was the price to pay, Sydney?" He seemed to freeze for a moment, but I wasn't sure if it was because of my father or because I was using his real name, which he despised. "Go to hell," he hissed. "You knew it was a mistake." I replied sarcastically. So what was the judge's decision? He was supposed to be released for stabbing the wrong woman by mistake. He walked around the bed and hit me hard in the face. I couldn't believe how much power this little meth bastard had. He walked up to Natalie, who was sitting naked and defeated on the bed. He said, "What do you say, policeman? Will you take this position?" He grabbed her by the hair and pulled her off the bed, forcing her to kneel in front of him. He tried to speed away, but he pulled her hair again and screamed, "Look straight ahead. And don't even think about closing your eyes. I hope you succeed because his life depends on it. If you are thinking about biting, think again." "You bastard," I shouted. I realized how powerless my words were. He looked at me with a grin. Fortunately, if that term can be applied here at all, it took less than a minute. It was less than a minute before he grunted, then bent down, put his hand under her chin to lift her face, looked at her and mockingly declared, "Stunned." He stepped back and wiped his face with the hem of his dirty shirt, then reached out, grabbed his wife by the throat and squeezed. I saw the rage in his eyes, so I needed to say something urgently, something to distract him, so I said, "In." He spoke in a calm but sarcastic tone. "Come on, Sydney. I'm sure you had a lot more of that while you were locked up." Fortunately, he let go of Nat's throat and, with the same fury in his eyes, walked around the bed and hit me in the face again. The blow stunned me for a moment, and I tasted blood flowing from my split lips. However, there was so much adrenaline flowing through my veins that it didn't hurt as much as it should have. He opened the blade of the night knife and grabbed my wife by the hair again, shoving the blade under her throat so that I could clearly see the dent it was leaving. "One more trick like you pulled and I'll give up the pleasure I was going to give you," he said. He looked like such an angry psychopath that I believed him. He was capable of anything. He pulled Nat off the bed and pushed her towards the door. It seemed like this bastard came prepared because he stopped her on the threshold and stabbed the blade in the back. He then stretched out his hand into the corridor to pick something up from the floor. When he pushed her back to the bed, he had a clothesline in his hands. I realized that he had taken it from my garage. I had no doubt what he was going to do with her. I felt so helpless that all I could do was pray for a miracle. And I did it. He pushed Natalie onto the bed on her back. He took a rope and tied one of her ankles to the bedpost. Then he cut the rope and crossed to the other side. He tied the other ankle and roughly pulled his wife's leg so that it was secured. He tied my other leg to a support. I wondered why he'd taped my leg and left wrist with duct tape and used handcuffs for the right one. Looking around the room, I saw an empty roll of duct tape lying under the drapes. I figured he'd thrown it when he was tying that up. While he was doing that, I tugged at the cuff of the handcuffs, hoping that maybe I could knock out the bar. The handcuffs were attached to an old chair. They were made to last, but they weren't standard police issue. There was no keyhole, just a small lever sticking out from the side of each cuff. The handcuffs looked old, and I assumed the lever was spring-loaded. It was loaded so that when you pressed it, it released the ratchet and opened the cuff. It looked like the toy handcuffs I remembered from childhood, but they were not plastic and were probably used in theatrical performances or magical acts. The handcuffs were made in such a way that the person shackled in them could undo the cuff. It didn't matter if he was shackled in front or behind. After tying Nat's legs, the mutt tied her hands behind her back and sat on her chest, tying her wrists together with a gap of a few centimeters between them. He then cut the tape that was already binding her wrists. All of this was done in silence. It seemed that the little bastard was focused on his preconceived plan while this was happening. I was frantically trying to figure out how to pull the lever. I didn't have a double hinge in my hand and didn't have a nearby solid object to put pressure on the lever. I was desperate. After cutting the ribbon, the mongrel he wrapped another rope around his wife's right wrist and lifted her arms above her head, loosely tying the other end to the headboard. It was clear what he was thinking. He didn't want my wife to have her hands free, otherwise she could attack him and possibly scratch out his eyes. He repeated the process with he then got off the bed and tightened the ropes held by the women's hands, pulling them out until Nat was securely tied to the bed. He left Natalie's left arm mobile but not enough so that she could not harm the rapist. The process was repeated with the other hand, and now my wife's arms and legs were she was completely spread apart and completely vulnerable to his every whim. I tried not to show my fear or weakness, but tears were streaming down my cheeks as I looked at her helplessly. I smelled him around the same time I noticed a spreading wet spot on the bed. Nat's terror caused her bladder to empty. He strolled around the bed, admiring Nat's handiwork and naked body. When he noticed the urine-stained bedspread, he shouted obscenities at her. Then he grabbed the edge and pulled it out from under her, screaming, "I'm not going to lie in your stink, you stupid fool." He finally managed to calm down a little. He sat down next to her on the bed. Nat's face showed utter defeat. Helpless doesn't even come close to describing how I felt. I felt completely useless and emasculated. I've always worried about my wife. She was on patrol, but she had a gun, a partner, and a walkie I called for backup on the radio. Most police officers see only the consequences of violence throughout their careers and don't experience it themselves. My wife, the mother of my son, was going through the worst kind of violence. I knew this wasn't the end. I kept calling the mutt, shouting all the vile words I could think of, no matter how useless it sounded. I was trying to redirect his rage towards me, but he just laughed mockingly as he continued his attack. He came right up to me, and I hoped that he would give me a chance to bite off his appendage so that he would bleed out after killing us. The bastard patted my cheek and said, "Sit back and relax, detective. Enjoy your viewing. I know her name is Natalie, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it." I was hoping it wouldn't happen to Natalie, but I couldn't bear to watch it if it did. I didn't want such a memory to haunt me if we survived, so I either kept my eyes closed or looked at the floor. I was formulating a plan in my mind, but it required the bastard to leave the bedroom for at least a couple of minutes. I knew it was unlikely, but eventually I heard him grunting and breathing heavily. I realized this phase of our ordeal would end soon. Natalie was no longer crying, but her eyes were open and she was staring at the ceiling. At some point during the attack, when I either closed my eyes or focused on something else, the little bastard took off his dirty t-shirt. He was wearing a shirt, but dirty socks were on his ribs and his bony chest. I wondered how this almost emaciated man had managed to lift my 110 kilograms body up the stairs. He grinned at me and said, "Your old lady is so cute and tight. You must have a tiny end." His smile disappeared and he became manic again. His eyes gleamed as he leaned in and asked where my thing was. When I asked again what he meant, he turned around and slapped me on the ear. The blow to the head caused a blinding light and a loud ringing in my ear. The blow also reopened the cuts on my lip, and I tasted blood again. "Your gun. Your service revolver. Where is it? Don't play games with me. Otherwise, instead of pleasing your fool, I'll start hurting her until you tell me where he is." My 9mm Glock was in the bedroom closet on a shelf behind some books and it was not visible. Now I had the only chance I vaguely formulated in my mind. "Okay," I said, "just leave her alone. Hune's downstairs in the dining room." He seemed satisfied that he'd forced me to tell him the truth because he smiled and said, "I really quenched my thirst with your old lady. I think I need some refreshment before I turn it over and start the third round. Do you have a cold beer downstairs?" He had a manic grin on his face as he asked sarcastically, "Can I get you something while I'm downstairs?" He laughed out loud at his own joke. I was hoping he'd go look for beer in the kitchen first. In any case, I'll probably have a minute or so to try to implement my plan when I realized he was already halfway down the stairs. I whispered to Natalie, who was still staring at the ceiling, "He's gone downstairs. I have a plan, but It wasn't ideal when I heard the chair tipping over. I decided to do it myself. I started rocking the chair from side to side, knowing that I could tip it over. The problem was that I had to do it so that it fell on the side where the handcuffs were. I knew that no matter where Mutt was at that moment, he would hear the noise. I had to be very fast and very lucky. As it turned out, I was. As luck would have it, the chair tipped over on its side with the handcuffs. I waved my hand so that the release lever was turned to the floor and pushed, but nothing happened. The problem became clear immediately. I was lying on the carpet and the release lever was cushioned. I changed the position of my body as much as I could to put more pressure on. I felt the lever catch and moved my hand until it was free. Even against a skinny opponent, especially if he's with a knife, a man tied to a chair with one free hand is not a formidable opponent. My adrenaline must have given me extra strength because I was able to rock the chair enough. I was still relatively immobile and didn't have enough time to untie the tape binding my legs and left wrist when I heard footsteps. I slowly crawled towards the door using my forearm and clutching an improvised wooden baton. One of the things I learned over the years is that, from my years of working in the police, I've learned that a person's lower legs are the most vulnerable part of the body. Even a blow to the head could be sustained if it didn't render a person unconscious, especially since I couldn't reach his head in my position. I just leaned against the wall next to him. Sidney Mears came into the room and I hit him on the right shin so hard that I should have broken his leg. He fell, still clutching the knife in his right hand, but I couldn't reach it. He tried to get up, but while his head was still on the floor, I was able to deliver the final blow. I hit him twice in the back of the head and he collapsed on his face. I didn't know if he was unconscious or just stunned, but I could reach the knife if I moved my chair another meter. The bastard started moaning when I was able to free my other wrist and then my legs, trying to get up. I fell to the floor. After being tied up for a while, my knees started to hurt because they weren't getting enough blood flow. I managed to turn around and hit the guy again on the top of his head. I was hoping I hadn't killed him, but I felt like I had to. I felt like a quick death would have been too easy for him and for me. My revenge clouded my judgment. As my blood circulation returned to my legs, I awkwardly approached Natalie. When I freed her hands, she looked at me with a mixture of fear and relief, then started crying. When I freed her legs, the crying turned into heartbreaking sobs. She clenched her legs while I tried to calm her down and reassure her that everything would be fine, but she pushed me away and ran to the bathroom. She didn't say anything, and I was afraid that my wife was in shock. I could hear her throwing up for a long time, but I didn't want to. I tried to comfort Nat, who needed to be alone after she'd stopped vomiting. There was a short silence, then I heard the shower start working. Nat was in the shower for a long time, which gave me time to think about what to do next. I knew one thing for sure, this human trash. I was really upset to hear that this guy, who's a real piece of work, had only served 14 years of his life sentence. I think he was convicted of several violent crimes. He was charged with aggravated assault, armed robbery, resisting arrest and attempted violence. In fact, he was even charged with attempted murder of a member of a rival gang. I've always been amazed by the fact that judges, politicians, and even a huge number of caring citizens with their altruistic beliefs could look at these scoundrels in such an abstract manner, caring more about their human rights than about the rights of their helpless victims. In such an abstract manner, they care more about their human rights than about the rights of their helpless victims. What about the rights of Mary Ellen Condon and her young son and husband? What about the rights of all previous victims of Sidney Meyer's psychopathic past? What about my wife's right to live her life free from fear? She'll have to live the rest of her life in fear and with the likely psychological damage she may have suffered now. Society expects the police to protect them from all these psychopaths, but they don't. They expect politicians to pass laws that ensure these violent criminals stay in prison for the rest of their lives, but they refuse to do so. We were lucky in one respect, at least Johnny was at summer camp. He was an Eagle Scout and served as a camp counselor for a group of young scouts and was supposed to return home on Sunday. I had no doubt that if he had been at home or returned home during the attack, his fate would have been sealed. I checked the attacker's pulse and was relieved to find that he was alive, although unconscious. Despite the limited threat he now posed, I used the rope he used for Natalie to tie his arms and legs. I was still considering my options when Natalie finally came out of the bathroom, wearing sweatpants and a tank top. She looked pale and tired, but her eyes, although not smiling, showed that the catatonic glaze had disappeared from them. My wife was crying softly as we hugged. I don't know how long I hugged her, but our hug was interrupted when we heard the moan of a half. Natalie looked at me and asked if I'd called yet. When I shook my head, she looked at me with an expression that seemed to say, "Why not?" I tried to sit her down on the bed to explain my thoughts, but she didn't want to sit next to the stain on our bed. He had my and her closets between the bedroom and the bathroom. I got 2 folding chairs and put them as far away from the bed as possible. He sat on one of them and sat on the other facing her. Our knees were touching. I knew that despite all the trials I had gone through, what I was going to tell her. I know it might be difficult to accept, but I'm not going to call the police, I said firmly, before she could answer. Think about what that piece of did to us. I did it to you. He only served 14 years for the murder of a young, innocent mother. How long do you think he'll be in jail? For raping a policeman, 6, 8, maybe even 10 years. If he has at least one juror who resents the police, he might even get away with it. He's been in more trials than you. I've seen what some lawyers can do to smear a victim. Do you want to go through with it? Do you want to take the risk that this sociopath won't come back? We've got to get him back in there and finish the job, or we'll never know what he's up to. I don't want our son to go through the psychological trauma that the inevitable publicity can cause. Even if he does time and even if we never see him again, we'll know that at some point he'll be released back into society, which will allow him to commit even more violence. More violence against innocent people. Animals like him have no place in a civilized society. Unfortunately, our society doesn't know how to treat them in a way that protects us all. Natalie looked at me with an alternating expression of shock and understanding before she could answer. We heard our prisoner stir and begin. He mumbled some unintelligible words and managed to roll over on his side. When he looked at us, it became clear how the blood from the wound on his head had coagulated in one eye and was flowing down both sides of his face, making him look even more eerie than he already was. He grinned at us. He said it with a malicious laugh. I think your fool will have to wait a while for me to use her. He looked directly at his wife and said, "It's a pity, honey. I think you'd like it even more." Before he could say anything else, Nat jumped up from her chair, walked over, and kicked him in the balls so hard that she almost fell over. She bent down and spat in his face. Turning to me, she just nodded and left the room. He looked confused, and after a moment he asked, "Hey, why isn't this place crawling with cops? Did you decide to keep me with you so that I could properly serve your old lady?" I had a flashback of what he did to my wife. His laughter stopped abruptly when I kicked him in the groin again, and his body curled into a fetal position. I kicked him in the ribs and heard a distinctive crack. It took him a few minutes to recover enough to speak, and during that time I was explaining my plans. When he could speak, he hissed, "I hope you enjoyed it because my lawyer is going to have a tough day when the photos are shown to the jury. Not only will he leave you without a job, but we may even end up being cellmates." He grinned again and I realized that he was trying to make fun of me. This freak believed that the more damage I did to his body, the closer he would be to an excuse. I had no idea he wouldn't be leaving this house alive. I was just about to tell the mutt about his fate when I noticed Natalie standing right outside the door, just out of sight of her rapist. She motioned for me to join her, which I did while keeping a small bucket of pus in my field of vision. Natalie looked worried. As she whispered in my ear, "John, I agree with everything you've said and I know what you're thinking. I don't want to see him dead more than you do. I don't like the idea of being tormented by some sloppy lawyer who doesn't care about people who have been hurt, but it's not worth the risk that you'll be." She was caught and put in jail. She hugged me and cried softly into my chest. I really hate him, so much so that I could take this knife and stick it right in his chest. She sobbed. "John, I need you now more than ever. Johnny needs you. I can't lose you. I don't want to take any chances." The bastard must have heard what Natalie was whispering because he yelled, "Hey, you bastards, what are you talking about? I need medical help. I have my rights. You will pay for it. Wait until I get out. You haven't seen anything yet. You bastards. She's going to get what that stupid Kelly got." Compared to that, it was a walk in the park. My wife looked scared and probably realized I went back to the room where he could see and hear me. I was calm, but I was also firm. I told Natalie to get me a blue tarp from the garage, towels, and latex gloves. The tarp was under the shelves in front, near the workbench. Without another word, Natalie turned and headed down the stairs. Sydney's worry seemed to disappear as an arrogant grin appeared on his face. I squatted down next to him and hissed in a calm voice, "Listen to me carefully, you bastard. There will be no medics there. There won't be any cops, no arrests, no jury trials. I'm the judge, the jury, and the executioner. You'll never be able to harm us or any other innocent victims again. Let me explain what's going to happen in a few minutes. I'll take the knife you were going to use to kill us. Then I'll sit here and watch you bleed out. Then, shortly before you die, I'll wrap your disgusting, perverted little body in a tarp and put it in the trunk of my car. I have a nice place about 15 miles out of town near the county. I'll just throw it in the woods. It's a good place to bury a piece of human garbage, isn't it?" When he saw the hatred and determination in my eyes, the grin disappeared from his face. There were no more dirty remarks about my wife. Horror was written on the bastard's face, and he began to beg me. He realized what he had just said and tried to back off by adding, Okay. I deserve to be arrested. Maybe I went too far in trying to get revenge, but killing me is not the way out. I admit. I confessed my guilt and told him he'd get justice. He kept going on, but I didn't have the energy to engage with him. I unfolded the tarp on the bedroom floor, and he picked it up and threw it at me. It hit the carpet, but I still knocked the wind out of him. He screamed as the pain from a broken rib pierced his body. I'd once killed a man in a shootout after he robbed a store. He shot at me, so it was self-defense. I was defending myself, and to be honest, I didn't worry about it for a single night. He was a career criminal who had just beaten up an 18-year-old. I'd been an old cashier for not opening the cash register fast enough. Things were different now, though, and I had a doubt. Then I thought of Mary Ellen Kahn's naked and desecrated body lying on the pool table. I remembered her husband's blank stare when he testified in court. I changed my plan. His words, pleas and screams, no longer registered in my brain. They were just a cacophony of noise. Of course, I had no intention of showing him any measure of mercy, but I was tired of it and wanted to get it over with quickly. That was my decision. 2.5 years have passed since that hot August day, and as far as I know, Sydney Mears' body has never been found. Natalie and I now live in a condo near Myrtle Beach. We spend most of our time fishing in Merrill's Bay or playing golf. My wife obviously couldn't open her soul to a therapist, so it took her quite a long time to heal. As for me, I've never regretted what I did and haven't worried a single night about the administration of justice abroad.